10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to have a bash at Georgia because Eric's written a book on it. I'll be very happy to review it when it's out. But if you want to get ahead of the curve, Trotsky's book looks like this in one of its covers. It's on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's not a dishonest book at all, actually. I think it's a very well documented book based on sources from the time, and it tells some truths which Eric hasn't shared with you about the Georgian Democratic Socialist Republic as he describes it. So, for example, how does it begin? It begins when the losers, the Menshevik losers from the provisional government, are beaten in October 1917 and they retreat back to Georgia and they set up a trans-Caucasian republic. This is in a part of the world where there's huge intermingling and mixtures of peoples, where actually forming separate states was not the programme of any of the left parties. They form a trans-Caucasian federation at the beginning of 1918 and it lasts until, I think it's the 26th of May, is the split and the founding of Georgia. That's the day that Georgians celebrate. And it splits into these three states. And there is mass bloodletting. I mean, Turkey, for example, invades, all right, and you get the Armenian massacre. You get the setting up, not of a socialist or a Soviet government. There are Soviets in Georgia, which the Mensheviks take part in and are the majority, but it's a bourgeois government in that part of the world. And actually, in June, the Mensheviks essentially dissolve their involvement in the Soviets and become the bourgeois rulers of a bourgeois state. But it's worse than that, because how do they exist against the might of the Soviet Red Army? I'll tell you how they exist, because they get the German army to come in and act as protectors. And so for the bulk of 1918, Georgia, the Democratic Socialist Republic, exists under the German Imperial Army with a garrison in Tbilisi overseeing the protection of that country. And when the Germans are defeated at the end of 1918, who takes over that role? It's the British Imperial Army. So the Georgian so-called independent democratic republic is far, far from a utopia. Yes, it does pass some welfare measures, but it also allows the bloodletting of the South Ossetians, the Armenians and various other subject nationalities, which balkanises that part of the world. Now that's not a model that a Bolshevik or any sort of socialist, I think, is going to aspire to. They ban the Georgian Bolsheviks. There's a joke about it which says that the Georgian Bolsheviks are allowed to be illegal in the sense of leaving one clerk in charge of their headquarters while the rest of them are carted off to prison. I mean, that's not an idea of liberty. And by the way, they're extremely soft on the white armies during the Civil War. I mean, they let the movement of troops out of various parts of Georgia for troops that are captured and interned and then rejoin another army. So, for example, Giordano, I think is the pronunciation, the leader of the Georgian Mensheviks, he says to the German mission in October 1918, we are not neutral against the Bolsheviks. And then he says again in the January of 1920, in the Constituent Assembly, it's on the record, that he prefers the imperialists of the West to the fanatical Bolsheviks of the East. Now, let's get away from this idea that somehow there's this little island of democracy within a largely authoritarian sea. Georgia is not a model. And Georgia, you can have an argument about how it all ended. But let's talk about the reality of what actually happened in Georgia under Menshevik leadership. And the fact that people like Kautsky and Henderson and Snowden and various other of these charlatan reformists came over and covered up for it doesn't make it any better. So I think, let's see what's in Eric's book, but I hope those things are in it. A couple of points on objections. I mean, look, this central point about risk. Okay, I mean, take the international context. All right, people listen to Radio 4. They often have very good programmes, and one they had on recently was about the mutiny in the French army in May of 1917. Thousands upon thousands of French soldiers are mutinying in France at this time. In Britain, you've got shop stewards committees made up of thousands of militant workers who are organising strikes in wartime. You've got similar sorts of ferment in Germany. This is not a situation in which everywhere is quiescent, where all the workers are just going along with their imperialist governments. And, I think the wager that the Bolsheviks take is that we need to end this war, that this needless and pointless slaughter between two imperialist powers where the workers are killing each other. You know, that was a tremendously popular and democratic demand. And more than that, what they stood for, and it was a reasonable wager. Look at what happens very quickly after the Bolshevik Revolution. In Britain, you get police strikes. You know, you get the police trying to go on strike and form a union. Now, you know, they get beaten. You get the embryo of Soviets, not just in Britain, but in Germany and Hungary and all else around Europe. You get the mass upsurge of left parties that want to follow the Bolsheviks as a model. This is a reasonable wager to make on making socialism as an international socialist project. Now, yes, it did fail. It failed largely because people took the advice that people like Eric at the time, the Mensheviks, gave out. And they stuck with the mainstream social democracy, they stuck with supporting the bourgeois governments, and the left got beaten. But that doesn't mean the wager was wrong. And again, you know, I mean, Eric's really peeved about this Central Committee meeting, and I'll tell you why. Because the irony is, it took place in a Menshevik flat. Nikolai Sukhanov wrote a very good set of memoirs about that revolution. And the Central Committee meeting took place in his flat, and his partner was Galina Flaxman, who's a Bolshevik. And she managed to see him off so that the Central Committee on that night could have an uninterrupted row about whether to seize power or not. And thankfully she did, because then, you know, Sukhanov then goes off and writes a book. But read what Sukhanov says about the revolution in his memoir afterwards. He says, the Bolsheviks had an overwhelming majority of the workers and the soldiers, and the idea that this is a conspiracy is, quote, an absurdity. Martov, one of Eric's big heroes, a Menshevik leader, says, almost the entire proletariat stands with Lenin. And then Rosa Luxemburg. A lot of people have quoted Rosa Luxemburg. I thought Kathy's comments on this were particularly apposite. But what does Rosa Luxemburg say after this? She says that the Bolsheviks, in seizing power, have salvaged the reputation of the Russian Revolution and salvaged the reputation of international socialism, and that they, above all others, have dared to lead the workers to power. Now, that is the Rosa Luxemburg who we stand for, and that, I think, is the answer to the... I mean, this is a debate about freedom or tyranny. All right? This is a tremendously democratic and free revolution. This is what 1917 is about. And we should start with that in terms of our perspective. Now, I want to finish with relevance, because I think Joe made the point at the beginning and Sasha made it part of the way through. You know, where does this end up today? Look, we're not people who go around and say, you know, you do a carbon copy of what happened in 1917. I mean, look, dual power, if you think about it, is quite unstable and quite unusual. I would not predict that the British Revolution will happen in exactly that format. Okay, I might be wrong, but there are other ways in which a workers' struggle is likely to take place, particularly in the conditions where there is a bourgeois democracy, where there's a parliament and so on. And the Bolsheviks debated all this sort of stuff, all right? So it's not a carbon copy. The essence of Bolshevism was starting, and I think Joe alluded to this, with today's conditions, with the realities today, with understanding the world we're in today. And of course that world is very different. The world is very different because there's a massive working class, a much bigger working class, not just in places like Britain or Russia, but right across the globe. The prospects in terms of the power and the potential of the working class have never been greater. So of course we assess the situation. What do we take from it? We first and foremost take the idea of working class self-emancipation. We take the idea that workers can, by our own efforts, free ourselves from capitalism. And it was capitalism they lived under at that time. It's the fifth largest power. But for sure we live under capitalism now. So we understand that our programme for socialism is self-emancipation. We take the idea of party organisation, and we don't deny the fact that Bolsheviks had, by fighting the class struggle on three fronts, they had a whole series of very practical and sensible ideas about how you organise to win. And we'll be discussing that. I'm doing a session tomorrow about the party, and you know, I think the Bolshevik Party is an absolutely precious legacy, and a number of people have alluded to how that is. The Bolsheviks pioneered ideas of consistent democracy, and you know, where we would have more agreement on the platform over issues like Israel, Palestine, and Ireland and national questions today, it's the Bolshevik method of approaching the national question that we would look to. The Bolsheviks pioneered ideas such as the working class-based women's movement, and the ideas around women's liberation and their ideas of autonomy but linked to the labour movement that we would copy. And, you know, Sasha pointed out, where does this relate to the Labour Party? Well, there's a huge discussion in the Communist International at the Second Congress, before and during the Second Congress, a debate about what is the Labour Party and how should communists relate to it. And Lenin comes up with this very pithy formulation of a bourgeois workers' party to sum up what Labour is. And Labour is still that. You know, those kind of conflicts between the bourgeois elements and yet the link to the unions and the workers' movement and the potential of it. There's, you know, the united front, the workers' government. This is still a vocabulary and a set of ideas that are hugely relevant to how we live now and the kind of politics we're trying to develop now. So look, we don't just look back at the Russian Revolution uncritically. Yes, we can acknowledge mistakes, but what we try and do is learn from and be inspired by the sorts of revolutionaries that existed then, and the best of them were the Bolsheviks. And the best of them then, and the sorts of people that tried to build an international movement then, are the people whose shoulders we stand on today. So we don't start from scratch. We've got a tradition, we've got a basis for our movement, and if we go out there in today's conditions, in today's class struggle, and do the kind of things that the Bolsheviks did, we're in a position where we could, in the foreseeable future, we could win, and we could lead a revolution, and we could get rid of capitalism, and we could have a socialist society. And comrades, that is worth fighting for.
Again for coming, and thank you to Paul and thank you especially to Eric for coming to debate us.